Thank you for the opportunity to deliver this presentation. It's truly an honor to be in front of you along with the others in this symposium today. I'm going to talk about the most important and worst event in the history of our species, the end. And I'm going to talk about what we have known and what we now know with respect to the end of our species. I'll start with some lines from the Iliad, written by Homer some 2,800 years ago, because these lines seem particularly relevant today. Any moment might be our last. Everything is more beautiful because we are doomed. You will never be lovelier than you are now. We will never be here again. This paragraph was preceded by one in which Homer wrote, "Why the gods envy us. The gods envy us mortals because any moment may be our last." Because that notion that death can come at any time encourages us to live with urgency, to live with gratitude for what we have today. The gods, of course, some 2,800 years ago, as Homer was writing this book, the gods knew that they would live forever. So there is no reason to appreciate the moment. There are millions, billions, an infinity of moments to come. I want to talk a little bit about extinction, as I indicated, and specifically about how species go extinct. There are two means by which species go extinct. First, a limited ability to reproduce. For example, the last two white rhinos remain on a conservancy in Kenya, but they're both female, and so they cannot reproduce. They are functionally extinct already. Humans do not face this problem, obviously. There are nearly 8 billion people on Earth, and I don't see anybody slowing down the increase in the human population on this planet. Rather, the second means of extinction is almost certainly the one we face, loss of habitat. Once a species loses habitat, then it is in the position that it can no longer persist. We have managed to persist in artificial environments, sometimes for very long periods of time. The International Space Station comes to mind. McMurdo Station in Antarctica comes to mind. But bear in mind that the materials humans need in each of those places comes from Earth. The food, the water, the ability to persist in those environments is a direct result of the food and other means we need to survive here on Earth. So we extend our habitat artificially for short periods of time into other environments. What does it mean to require habitat? Humans obviously are animals, and we require habitat just as other organisms do in order to survive. I'll turn to a paper in the peer-reviewed Wildlife Society Bulletin by Linnea Hall and colleagues, published in the spring of 1997 issue of Wildlife Society Bulletin. And I quote, "We therefore define habitat as the resources and conditions present in an area that produce occupancy, including survival and reproduction by a given organism." Habitat is organism specific. Habitat is the sum of the specific resources that are needed by organisms. Whenever an organism is provided with resources that allow it to survive, that is habitat. End quote. Without all those materials that we need to survive, that any species needs to survive, that species goes extinct. This applies to human animals as well as to other organisms on Earth. Earth is rapidly losing habitat for humans right now. A paper by Raymond and colleagues in the May 8, 2020 issue of Science Advances, titled "The Emergence of Heat and Humidity Too Severe for Human Tolerance," indicates that people are dying as a result of high wet bulb temperatures. Wet bulb temperatures result from the combination of high temperature and high humidity. The result of living in such conditions is often organ failure. And this organ failure is what leads to death of human beings. It's already going on right now in many places in the tropics and subtropics throughout the world. On July 1st, 2021, Zhao and others published in the Lancet Planetary Health an article titled Global, Regional, and National Burden of Mortality Associated with Non-Optimal Ambient Temperatures from 2000 to 2019, a three-stage modeling study. Zhao and colleagues, and there were many, wrote in this peer-reviewed article that more than 5 million people die each year due to non-optimal ambient temperatures, and almost always those non-optimal ambient temperatures result from high temperatures and high humidities at specific locations. So it's already happening. People around the globe are already dying as a result of lethal wet bulb temperatures leading to organ failure. This is not something for the future. It is something we are facing right now. One of the difficulties we have as human organisms is our inability to understand the exponential function. We are in the midst of exponential climate change. The rate of increase keeps increasing. And so we do not face the rapid rate of environmental change that was faced by previous generations. What we face is much faster, much worse than previous generations have had to deal with. I'm going to show a very short video that describes the exponential function, one of the more difficult concepts for humans to deal with, because throughout the history of our species, we haven't had to deal with exponential changes in almost anything. We can almost always predict the near future based on the recent past, but not in the case of the exponential function. So here's the short video.
Everybody knows about playing with dominoes, but what you may not know is that a domino can knock over another domino which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes. And the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready? Boom. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
So you can see that the exponential function has great importance for our species, especially when it comes to events such as abrupt climate change. We are in the midst of abrupt climate change, which means the exponential function is now in play. I'll quote from a couple sources to indicate that we are in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. Not only is the climate changing in exponential fashion, but it appears that we are faced with irreversible climate change at the same time. So, first I quote Andrew Y. Glikson, the famous paleoclimatologist who works in Australia and lives there as well. This is from the October 9th, 2020 book, The Age of Consequences. Quote, during the Anthropocene, greenhouse gas forcing has risen by more than 2 watts per meter squared, equivalent to more than 2 degrees C above pre-industrial temperatures, which constitutes an abrupt event over a period not much longer than a lifetime. think about that for a minute. The exponential change in this case is occurring at a very rapid rate, not much longer than a human lifetime. And Glickson indicates that we have already exceeded the 2 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline that we've been warned about for a very long time. Secondly, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their September 24, 2019 report, concluded that climate change is irreversible due to an overheated ocean. Why? Because the ocean is overheated and there's nowhere for that heat to go. When the ocean releases that heat into the atmosphere at a rapid rate, as is currently going on, our entire environment is subject to rapid rate of heating, of a rapid rate of temperature increase. This from the IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, again published September 24th, 2019. So, we're in the midst of a mass extinction event. We are in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change that is driving that mass extinction event. The ongoing event is typically referred to as the Anthropocene mass extinction event. As was pointed out by the United Nations Environment Program in August of 2010, quote, Earth is in the midst of a mass extinction of life. Scientists estimate that 150 to 200 species of plant, insect, bird, and mammal become extinct every 24 hours. Every day, an estimated 150 to 200 species go extinct. This is nearly 1,000 times the natural or background rate and is greater than anything the world has experienced since the vanishing of the dinosaurs nearly 65 million years ago. The rate of environmental change is proceeding far too rapidly for almost all organisms on Earth to keep up with, according to this report, now more than 11 years old. The Secretary General of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity said upon release of that report in August of 2010, quote, no country has met its targets to protect nature. We are losing biodiversity at an unprecedented rate. If current levels of destruction go on, we will reach a tipping point very soon. The future of the planet now depends on governments taking action in the next few years, end quote. This is more than 11 years ago. We did not take action within the next few years. Rather, we have proceeded to heat the planet even faster than at any time in human history over the course of the last decade or so. Finally, more than 6 years later, the peer-reviewed literature catches up with a paper by Gerardo Ceballos and colleagues published in June 15th in the renowned peer-reviewed publication Science Advances. As Ceballos said at the time, in an interview coincident with the release of this very important paper, quote, life would take many millions of years to recover, and our species itself would likely disappear early on, end quote. Our species itself would likely disappear early on. I'm shocked we made it this far. This was several years ago, and here we are, not only able to persist, not only able to get up and carry on our duties every day, but also with this amazing technology that allows us to reach out across thousands of miles. Some 2 years later, Gerardo Ceballos and colleagues, publishing this time in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, in an article that includes the phrase biological annihilation. Biological annihilation. That sounds pretty serious, because it is. The second author on each of these papers is Professor Paul Ehrlich from Stanford University, and he said upon release of this second paper, the one that includes biological annihilation in the title, quote, we're toxifying the entire planet, end quote. That sounds like bad news, because it's really bad news. A really important factor, as I've already indicated, is the rate of change. the rate of environmental change, which in our case results from a rapid increase in industrial activity. As a couple of examples, we are witnessing a profound extinction of vertebrates and mammals, as pointed out in the peer-reviewed literature, first by Quintero and Wiens in Ecology Letters, June 26, 2013, indicating that vertebrate species are going extinct because they can't keep up with the rate of environmental change. In fact, they lag by 10,000 times behind the slow rate of environmental change projected by the United Nations. In other words, up through 2100. Even at that very slow rate of projected change, vertebrates cannot keep up. Vertebrates cannot keep up with the rapid rate of environmental change, and so they're going extinct. We are vertebrates. Davis and colleagues, in their paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences on October 30th, 2018, also indicate that mammals cannot keep up. We show that even if extinction rates slow to pre-anthropogenic background levels, recovery will likely take millions of years. That's the take-home message from this paper by Davis and colleagues in October of 2018. Again, rate of environmental change is critical to understanding how any species goes extinct, including our own. The signature paper on this topic came from Giovanni Strona and Corey Bradshaw and was published November 13th, 2018 in the renowned journal Scientific Reports. Again, the word annihilate appears in the title. Coextinctions annihilate planetary life during extreme environmental change. And the extreme environmental change in this case is a 5 or 6 degree Celsius global average rise in temperature, which we are seeing play out over the course of a relatively few years, not decades and not centuries from now. The take-home messages from this peer-reviewed article indicate, quote, in a simplified view, the idea of coextinction reduces to the obvious conclusion that a consumer cannot survive without its resources. In other words, we are all connected. Every species is connected to many other species, and those at the, quote, top of the food chain, such as Homo sapiens, are dependent upon many other species, and when those other species face challenges, we face challenges as well. Another quote from the paper, a rogue, seemingly desert Earth wandering across the universe could still have some tiny chance of blooming again under some lucky and unlikely circumstances. Wow, that's our odds of having an Earth with any life on it. Lucky and unlikely circumstances. If that's what you're counting on for the continued persistence of our species, Homo sapiens, then I think you're relying too much on hope, otherwise known as wishful thinking. As I indicated, our species, like most others, faces extinction because of loss of habitat. Already, according to the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System, which published a paper called Global Trends to 2030, Challenges and Choices for Europe, written by Gaub and colleagues in April of 2019. And here's the take-home message. Quote, an increase of 1.5 degrees is the maximum the planet can tolerate. Should temperatures increase further, we will face even more droughts, floods, extreme heat, and poverty, and at worst, the extinction of humankind altogether. At worst, from 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline, quote, the extinction of humankind altogether. As indicated in the direct quote from this important synthetic paper, quote, an increase of 1.5 degrees is the maximum the planet can tolerate, end quote. Well, Earth was at least 1.73 degrees above the 1750 baseline in April of 2017. Earth is at least 2°C above the 1750 baseline, according to Sam Carana posting at the Arctic News blog, and also according to Andrew Glickson, who I already quoted, the famed paleoclimatologist, in his book, The Age of Consequences, which came out about a year ago, October of 2020. So again, we almost certainly face our own extinction because of loss of habitat. And this should not come as a surprise. It's nothing new. Several species in the genus Homo, which is the same genus we are in, Homo sapiens, several previous species in the genus Homo have already gone extinct because they lost habitat. Not because they failed to reproduce adequately, but because habitat was lost at a particular time on Earth. I'm going to describe very briefly something called the McPherson Paradox, named by my online acquaintance and supporter, Bill Eddy. The McPherson Paradox indicates that as a result of continued industrial activity which further heats the planet, we will lose habitat. Or, and here's the paradox part, decreased industrial activity heats the planet even faster than the ongoing rate of overheating of the planet. A few details are needed. First, Tim Garrett, professor at the University of Utah, has described in more than 5 peer-reviewed articles that civilization is a heat engine. He has described this process and provided considerable details about how and why civilization itself is a heat engine. And this is the important part. No matter how civilization is powered, it is still a heat engine. Whether it's powered by solar panels, wind turbines, or fossil fuels, civilization, yes, including industrial civilization, is a heat engine. All the solar panels, all the wind turbines, all the wave power, all of these so-called means of renewable energy are in fact derivative energy. These means are derived from fossil fuels and also limited materials found on Earth. For example, the creation of solar panels requires abundant rare earths. Solar panels also require an enormous amount of fossil fuels to get those rare earths out of the ground, refined, processed, and delivered to the place where the solar panels are made. And I don't think at this point there is a solar panel factory that is running on solar panels. Rather, grid-tied electricity produced by burning fossil fuels is providing the energy for converting these rare earths and other materials into solar panels and wind turbines and the infrastructure for wave power and so on. So this is a tremendous problem that appears to be insurmountable at this time. More of the details. How fast is the planet heating up? If civilization is a heat engine, then it really matters how rapidly that heat is being brought to Earth. Burke and colleagues in the December 26, 2018 issue of Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, in a paper titled Pliocene and Eocene Provide Best Analogs for Near Future Climates. In this paper, Burke and colleagues point out that, quote, our study suggests that climates like those of the Pliocene will prevail as soon as 2030 in the current era and persist under climate stabilization scenarios. Even if we manage to stabilize the climate by 2030, which seems unlikely to me, we will still be facing the Pliocene. This outcome is based upon the IPCC's representative concentration pathways. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came up with these representative concentration pathways, all of which ignore the loss of aerosol masking, or the aerosol masking effect, and also dozens of self-reinforcing feedback loops. So civilization is a heat engine no matter how it's powered, and it's taking us as soon as 2030 to the Pliocene, the mid-Pliocene was considerably warmer than temperatures currently on Earth. So this poses a tremendous challenge. Yet, at the same time, decreasing industrial activity leads to even more rapid heating through loss of something called aerosol masking. This is something that is very poorly reported on, and particularly by the corporate media. But here's the story. When sun's rays strike the Earth, they heat Earth, primarily because heat is trapped, because some of the long-wave radiation that would re-radiate back out into space is trapped by carbon dioxide, by methane, by water vapor. And these are primary greenhouse gases that act as a trap to hold the heat onto Earth. So once the Earth is heated, that re-radiation back into space is blocked by the greenhouse gases, and therefore the planet continues to warm up. However, decreased industrial activity results in decreased aerosols. These aerosols are a result of industrial activity, most notably by burning coal, and these aerosols go up into the atmosphere and prevent incoming sunlight from even striking Earth. They act as something like an umbrella that prevents incoming radiation from striking Earth and therefore warming it up, therefore having it trapped. These aerosols therefore prevent additional heating by reflecting the incoming sunlight back into space before it ever strikes the Earth. Before the sun's rays strike the Earth, they are sent back out into space from where they came. This is called the aerosol masking effect, or global dimming, and it results from those aerosols associated with industrial activity. The aerosol masking effect is sometimes called global dimming, and as pointed out by Levy and colleagues in the May 20th, 2013 issue of the peer-reviewed Journal of Geophysical Research, Atmospheres, as little as a 35% reduction in industrial activity will cause a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature rise. So we've known this since May of 2013, some 8.5 years ago. There's more. A subsequent paper by Rosenfeld and colleagues, published on February 8th, 2019, in the renowned journal Science, finds that the measured aerosol cloud-mediated cooling effect was much larger than the present estimates, and those present estimates included the paper by Levy and colleagues, published in May of 2013. So, as is frequently pointed out in the peer-reviewed literature, new information indicates the conservative nature of previous information. So previously published information tends to be overcome by new information, illustrating that the previous work was too conservative. That's the case one more time with the topic of the aerosol masking effect. According to a paper by Gia and colleagues, published June 15th, 2021 in the renowned Nature Communications, entitled Significant Underestimation of Radiative Forcing by Aerosol Cloud Interactions Derived from Satellite-Based Methods. According to this paper in the renowned Nature Communications, aerosol masking accounts for a 55% increase in overall planetary heating. If we lose the aerosol masking, which according to James Hansen, the godfather of climate change, will happen within 5 days after the aerosols are released. So it takes 5 days for the aerosols that are protecting Earth from considerable rise in temperature. They fall out of the atmosphere within 5 days. When that happens, according to this paper in Nature Communications, aerosol masking accounts for 55% increase in overall planetary heating, 133% over land, and 33% over ocean. Most of us live on land, and so we will experience a very rapid rise in global average temperature, more than one additional degree of heating in a very short period of time. Already, vertebrates and mammals cannot keep up with the rapid rate of environmental change and the projected rate of environmental change. That's already happening. The kind of rapid change in environmental conditions associated with loss of aerosol masking would be catastrophic for vertebrates, mammals, for all life on Earth, as pointed out in the paper by Strona and Bradshaw. I'll turn once again to the notion of extinction of all life on Earth, humans included, with the paper by Strona and Bradshaw I already mentioned, titled Coextinctions Annihilate Planetary Life During Extreme Environmental Change. So this paper in a renowned peer-reviewed journal indicates that we could lose all life on Earth, as I already indicated. First author Giovanni Strona was quoted by the Australia's SBS News, coincident with the release of this paper. Quote, "Our paper demonstrates that even the most tolerant species ultimately succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear. Well, as it turns out, very inconveniently, humans depend upon many, many species for our own survival. The species that clean our water, clean our air, pollinate our food, comprise our food, are pivotal to our continued existence on this planet, and yet, as a result of the ongoing mass extinction event, as a result of planetary overheating occurring at a very rapid rate, we are losing those species. And when we lose those species, we lose the means by which our species continues to persist." There's more. With respect to the topic of extinction of all life on Earth, a paper by Neves and colleagues published January 9th, 2020, also in Scientific Reports, the same renowned journal in which Strona and Bradshaw published their work. And in this paper, they point out that tardigrades, the go-to species for people who believe that we cannot possibly drive all species to extinction, tardigrades too are sensitive to high temperatures. Here's the take-home line. Global warming is already having harmful effects on habitats worldwide and is therefore important to gain an understanding of how rising temperatures may affect extant animals. Tardigrades are renowned for their ability to tolerate extreme conditions, but their endurance towards high temperatures clearly has an upper limit. High temperatures thus seem to be their Achilles heel. In other words, even tardigrades probably will not survive global high temperatures. If tardigrades don't make it, I can guarantee, against all of my best wishes, that humans will not make it as well. More about extinction of all life on Earth. A paper by Tressos and colleagues published April 8, 2020 in Nature, entitled "The Projected Timing of Abrupt Ecological Disruption from Climate Change," indicates the following information. We project that future disruption of ecological assemblages as a result of climate change will be abrupt. And that's no big surprise because it's already abrupt. So even if we continue at the current pace, which is abrupt, we're still going to be facing abrupt climate change. They go on, will be abrupt because within any given ecological assemblage, the exposure of most species to climate conditions beyond their realized niche limits occurs almost simultaneously. Under a high emissions scenario, such abrupt exposure events begin before 2030. These results highlight the impending risk of sudden and severe biodiversity losses from climate change and provide a framework for predicting both when and where these events may occur. End quote. It's already happening. We're already into the decade before the 2030s. Already we are experiencing abrupt climate change. This paper by Tressos and colleagues focused specifically on ocean life. As indicated by Captain Paul Watson, founder of Sea Shepherd, quote, "If the oceans die, we die. We can't live on this planet with a dead ocean." End quote. And that, according to Tressos and colleagues, from their paper published about a year and a half ago, is where we're headed. Disruption of ecological assemblages leading to loss of life in the ocean. Sadly, there are more means by which we can destroy all life on Earth. A paper by Owens and colleagues in the May 20th, 2021 issue of Solar Physics titled Extreme Space Weather Events and the Solar Cycle indicates that a solar storm, such as the September 1st and 2nd, 1859 Carrington event, could cause sufficient disruption of electromagnetic systems to sufficiently reduce aerosol masking. This would lead to an abrupt rise in global average temperatures, as I already pointed out. This rapid increase in global average temperature would threaten all life on Earth with extinction. According to a paper published in phys.org on June 1st, 2021, titled Ancient Volcanic Eruption Destroyed the Ozone Layer. I don't know how it can be any more clear than that. That's the title. Ancient volcanic eruption destroyed the ozone layer. We need the ozone layer like we need those other species for our continued persistence on Earth. The coinciding peer-reviewed article was published in Communications, Earth and Environment entitled The Toba Supervolcano Eruption Caused Severe Tropical Stratospheric Ozone Depletion. That's terrifying. Ozone depletion causes an enormous increase in radiation striking the Earth, including striking humans, and will lead to extremely high rates of cancer and a rapidly overheated Earth. There's a reason the Montreal protocols were followed with respect to chlorofluorocarbons in an attempt to reduce the size of the ozone hole over the Antarctic. And the reason is that we lose habitat, we lose the ability to persist on this most beautiful of planets when the ozone goes away. So this paper from April 12th, 2021 in the renowned Nature series of journals, Communications, Earth and Environment, indicates that the Toba supervolcano eruption caused severe tropical stratospheric ozone depletion. That was from one volcano. From one volcano. We can only imagine the kind of ozone loss that will result from the catastrophic uncontrolled meltdown of nuclear power plants, for example, which there are more than 450 around the globe. We can only imagine what is going on already with respect to increased volcanism resulting from abrupt climate change. Another means of extinction of all life on Earth comes from, of all places, a politician. President Niinisto of Finland said on August 28, 2017, quote, "If we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. That is reality." He was speaking with President Trump in a press conference in the Oval Office at the time. If we lose the Arctic, we lose the globe. That is reality. And I suspect what he was referring to was the loss of albedo or reflectance when we lose the ice on the Arctic Ocean. Arctic ice is the planetary air conditioner. And if we lose that ice and convert this reflective white substance, snow and ice, if we convert that instead to a dark blue ocean color, we will lose an enormous amount of albedo in a very short period of time. That albedo or reflectance is what allows us to persist on this relatively cool planet right now. It's not as if we haven't been warned. I'll present a history of these warnings that we have received basically throughout history. I turn most notably and importantly to the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases in their October 1990 report. The Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases was created in 1985 by the International Council of Scientific Unions, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Meteorological Organization. And it persisted for only about 5 years. This was one of their final statements in October of 1990. Quote, "Beyond 1 degree C," that refers specifically to 1 degree C above the 1750 baseline, "beyond 1 degree C may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. The advisory group on greenhouse gases clearly understood that a rapid increase in global average temperature would lead to extensive ecosystem damage. Not only that, they knew that we depend upon ecosystems for our own survival, and extensive ecosystem damage is really bad news. At the time, the advisory group on greenhouse gases recommended a maximum CO2 equivalent concentration of 330 to 400 parts per million. 330 to 400 parts per million. We're already at 415 to 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. The CO2 equivalent includes, in addition to carbon dioxide, methane, and more than 40 other greenhouse gases that are contributing to the overheating of the planet. 330 to 400 parts per million, we're already over 410 parts per million based upon CO2 alone. Add methane, and we're at more than 600 parts per million CO2 equivalent. And the upper limit was 400 parts per million equivalent of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we're living on borrowed time, and the warnings, most notably this one from 1990, were preceded by many others and have been followed by others as well. Let's go back to John Tyndall's 1863 lecture on climate change, also published in his 1872 book, a very long time ago, more than 150 years ago. John Tyndall pointed out the mechanism underlying planetary warming. He described the greenhouse effect in 1863, or, if you want the written, more permanent version, in 1872. And I quote, "Thus the atmosphere admits of the entrance of the solar heat, but checks its exit, and the result is a tendency to accumulate heat at the surface of the planet." End quote. The language is a little different than what we would use today, but the message is clear. Those greenhouse gases trap the heat once the sun heats the earth. And that heat trap, that blocking of long-wave radiation from leaving the atmosphere, continues to overheat the planet. This was 1863 for the lecture and 1872 for the book. Even before then, George Perkins Marsh, naturalist and ambassador of the United States, in an address delivered to the Agricultural Society of Rutland County, where I currently live, this in 1847, quote, "The mean temperature of London is a degree or two higher than that of the surrounding country." And German scientist Pallas believed that the climate of even so thinly a peopled country as Russia was sensibly modified by similar causes, end quote. What Marsh is referring to is today called the urban heat island effect. All that asphalt, all that concrete, all the buildings concentrated in a relatively small area causes that area to heat up and to retain the heat at night. That's the urban heat island effect. So it's warmer in London, as he pointed out in 1847, by 1 or 2 degrees than in the adjacent countryside. The urban heat island effect has been known for a long time. The first peer-reviewed article, there were other articles that were called peer-reviewed, but they didn't really go through the process of peer review that we think of today as being peer-reviewed articles. So I will refer to Svante Arrhenius's April 1896 paper in the peer-reviewed Philosophical Magazine and Journal of Science, in which Arrhenius predicted a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature increase by the year 2000. So 104 years in advance. He missed it by about 1/4 of a degree. And he probably didn't know about the aerosol masking effect, or he would have missed on the underside by considerably more than 1 degree C. So not too bad 104 years in advance. The data themselves came from Guy Callender in the February 1938 issue, the Quarterly Review of the Royal Meteorological Society, again a peer-reviewed journal. And you can see from the evidence here that a vacillating temperature since 1880 continues up until about halfway through this graph. Shortly after about 1940, the temperature rises, and although there is some fluctuation in the rise, the trend is all up through the early 1900s into the 1920s, and up until this paper was published in the peer-reviewed Quarterly Review of the Royal Meteorological Society in February of 1938. So we've known the mechanism based on Tyndall's work. We've known the prediction for a rapid increase in temperature based on Arrhenius's work. We see the evidence right in front of us based on Callender's peer-reviewed work. And the response? Well, here's an advertisement in Life magazine from February 2nd, 1962. It indicates that Humble Oil, which became Exxon later, Humble is bragging because it supplies enough fossil energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier every day. This was in the days when that cheap energy through fossil fuels was something to brag about. That's 1962. United States President Richard Nixon, September 17, 1969, in a memorandum written to John Ehrlichman, said carbon dioxide very clearly is a problem, and the underline appears in his original typed version, Richard Nixon's original typed version. Carbon dioxide clearly is a problem, and perhaps most particularly is one that can seize the imagination of persons normally indifferent to projects of apocalyptic change. So he's referring to the carbon dioxide problem as one of apocalyptic change. The process is a simple one. It is now pretty clearly agreed that the CO2 content will rise by 25% by the year 2000. This could increase the average temperature near the Earth's surface by 7 degrees Fahrenheit. Fortunately, it didn't yet. Almost certainly because of the lag in maximum heating associated with carbon dioxide, and also because of the aerosol masking effect. Nixon goes on in his memorandum, it is entirely possible that there will be countervailing effects. For example, an increase of dust in the atmosphere would tend to lower temperatures and might offset the CO2 effect. Similarly, it is possible to conceive fairly mammoth man-made efforts to countervail the CO2 rise. So Nixon clearly knew about the aerosol masking effect when he refers to an increase of dust in the atmosphere would tend to lower temperatures. Yes, dust and other particles, including today, smoke from wildfires and other small particles that get into the atmosphere and block incoming solar radiation. Those are the kinds of things that Nixon obviously knew about in September of 1969. It is possible to conceive fairly mammoth man-made efforts to countervail the CO2 rise. Well, that hasn't happened. And at this late state in the history of our species, I just don't see how that will happen. Al Gore, Carl Sagan, and James Hansen testified to the United States Congress in the 1980s. 1985 for Gore and Sagan, 1988 for James Hansen. NOAA last measured a temperature increase below the average for the preceding 30 years in February of 1985. So the warnings continue, the testimony continues from the likes of Carl Sagan, Al Gore, and James Hansen in Congress. And the temperature continues to go in the same direction. Global average temperature is on the rise, even as it is pointed out over and over again that disaster lies not far in the future. According to the Associated Press on June 29th, 1989, since it appeared in the Associated Press, it appeared in every major newspaper in the United States. Noel Brown, director of the New York office of the UN Environment Program, that's the United Nations Environment Program, said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. We had 10 years in 1989. Let's just call it 1990 and say we had until the year 2000 to solve the greenhouse effect. That was 21 years ago, and we didn't solve anything. Note the headline, UN predicts disaster if global warming not checked. This was in the middle of 1989. Again, just over a year later, the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases points out that beyond 1 degree C may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage, and has. It's past tense now. There has been extensive ecosystem damage. The warnings continue. This one from the April 3rd, 2006 cover story of Time magazine in the United States, special report on global warming. And here we have, decades after Humble Oil bragged about producing enormous energy from fossil fuels, in Natural Gas Intelligence on May 28, 2014, climate change a top priority, says ExxonMobil CEO. It's something to brag about in 1962. It's something to be very concerned about in 2014. The warnings continue along with the evidence well beyond that point. David Spratt, climate writer and speaker, indicates that we triggered self-reinforcing feedback loops somewhere around 0.5 degrees C above the 1750 baseline. That was in a presentation he delivered in October of 2014. I have identified 65 self-reinforcing feedback loops, and I stopped keeping track in this particular essay on August 2nd, 2016. So, in other words, more than 5 years ago, I stopped counting, and at that point, the United Nations had not admitted that climate change was irreversible. That came later. Antonio Guterres on September 10th, 2016 indicates, quote, "World has until 2020 to change course in order to avoid runaway climate change." We didn't change course in 2020. United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their October 8th, 2018 report indicates, quote, "With clear benefits to people and natural ecosystems, limiting global warming to 1.5 C compared to 2 C could go hand in hand with ensuring a more sustainable and equitable society." This after we already knew that we had eclipsed the 1.5 mark, and shortly before it was reported that we have eclipsed the 2 degree mark. Again, what do we do with this information? How do we live? We are in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change. And yet most people continue to believe that the economy is more important than the environment. We are in the midst of a mass extinction event. As Gerardo Ceballos pointed out, life would take many millions of years to recover, and our species itself would likely disappear early on. I'm grateful for every day that our species has not disappeared early on or even today. The approach I've been taking for several years is that of planetary hospice. And I point out from Stephen Jenkinson, who was involved with the medical society and also with work on grief, quote, "The great enemy of grief is hope. Hope is the 4-letter word for people who are unwilling to know things for what they are. Our time requires us to be hope-free, to burn through the false choice of being hopeful and hopeless. They are two sides of the same con job. Grief is required to proceed, and grief recovery is also required to proceed." Let me turn to the definition, the Merriam-Webster online dictionary definition of hope. Hope is to cherish a desire with anticipation, to want something to happen, to be true. I prefer action rather than wishful thinking. And as a consequence, I've been taking action. In addition, we need to grieve and we need to recover from that grieving. My favorite definition of grief comes from the Grief Recovery Institute, wishing for a different past. There's no going back. There's not much going forward. But certainly, wishing for a different past is no solution. As I've written in the peer-reviewed literature in a paper in Clinical Psychology Forum, quote, the belief in a positive future, or hope, is not useful when presenting a person with a terminal diagnosis. Wishful thinking is no route to recovery, and it might interfere with the ability of a person to complete relationships during their final days. Hospice is a particularly effective strategy for palliative end-of-life care. Similarly, hospice is an obvious strategy to address the near-term demise of Homo sapiens. End quote. I'm not sure how to implement planetary hospice. I've talked about it at some length. How do we deal with anticipatory grief, grief to be had in the future at a large scale? What are the characteristics of hospice that allow us to proceed? How do we scale up palliative end-of-life care to an entire society? Again, I turn to Homer in the Iliad. Any moment might be our last. This idea encourages me to live with urgency and also to live with integrity. Why would I lie to people if we only have a very short time remaining? And we only have a very short time remaining. I'm no fan of hope. I'm no fan of wishful thinking. I turn to Edward Abbey, the desert anarchist, for a couple of lines. Action is the antidote to despair, and sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul, says this atheist. Buddhism and Hinduism clearly affected Edward Abbey. Among the other principles of Buddhism and Hinduism are taking right action and not being attached to the outcome. As Viktor Frankl pointed out in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, written shortly after he survived as a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany, quote, between a stimulus and a response, there is a space. In that space is the power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. The last of human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances. We can also choose our actions as well as our attitude. Finally, I turn to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Quote, the purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived, and lived well. Those are words to live by. To live and to live well. To find meaning in one's own life, as I have through my teaching. And to make a difference in the lives of others, if only in one life, I think is noteworthy and useful. That's why I continue to deliver presentations such as this one, to submit to interviews, and along with my partner, to offer the Only Love Remains workshop, which you can find at onlyloveremains.org. Again, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I'm sorry I have terrible news, but better the full truth than delusion. We have enough of the latter in our lives. Thank you very much.